Picture this. It's a crisp autumn morning at Windsor Castle. The sun barely breaks through the ancient stone walls
The situation
as
is
King
more
Charles
critical
III
than you know.
prepares for what
What
should
are your
be a
orders?
routine
We must
inspection of
act
the Royal
now
Guard.
before it's
He's
too
done
late.
this hundreds of times
Sir,
before,
the delegation has
walking the
arrived.
same path
So
his
soon,
mother,
lead on.
Queen Elizabeth,
This
walked
way,
for
sir. Very
70
well.
years. The red-coated guards stand
I must
perfectly
speak
still,
with you
their tall
immediately.
black hats creating an
situation
imposing
is
line
most
of British
grave.
tradition. But today would be different. Today, one guard would make a decision that would send shockwaves through Buckingham Palace, challenge centuries of royal
Majesty, a
protocol,
moment.
and reveal
What
a
is
truth
it?
so powerful
Urgent news
it
from the
would
council.
change how the
Very
world
well,
sees the
proceed.
monarchy forever. What could make a loyal royal guard, sworn to protect the crown with his life, suddenly step forward and stop his own king? What secret was so urgent, so dangerous, that breaking the most sacred rule of royal service became the only option? The answer would expose a hidden world within the palace walls, where loyalty and duty collide with conscience and truth, where one man's courage would either save the monarchy or destroy it forever. This is not just a story about breaking protocol. This is a story about the moment when doing what's right becomes more important than following orders. When a single act of defiance reveals the human heart beating beneath the crown. Get ready to discover what really happened that morning when everything changed, and why the palace tried so desperately to keep this story buried forever. James Harrison had been dreaming of this moment his entire life. Standing tall in his crimson uniform, the morning sun casting long shadows across the Windsor Castle courtyard, he represented everything noble about British tradition. At 28 years old, James had already served 6 years in the Royal Guard, earning respect from his fellow guardsmen and commendation from his superiors. His grandfather had served Queen Victoria, his father had protected Queen Elizabeth II, and now James stood ready to serve King Charles III with the same unwavering dedication. The morning started like any other. James arrived at the castle before dawn, as he had every day for the past 6 years. He polished his boots until they gleamed like black mirrors, pressed his red tunic until every fold was perfect, and adjusted his tall black bearskin hat with military precision. The routine never changed, and James found comfort in this consistency. In a world where everything seemed uncertain, the Royal Guard remained a pillar of stability and tradition. But today felt different. James couldn't shake the strange feeling that had been growing in his chest for the past 3 weeks. It had started with a conversation he overheard in the palace corridors, a hushed discussion between 2 senior advisors that made his blood run cold. They were talking about covering something up, something that could damage the monarchy's reputation forever. At first, James tried to dismiss it as palace gossip, the kind of idle chatter that always circulated in the halls of power. However, the feeling only grew stronger when James noticed unusual activity around the king's private chambers. Strange visitors coming and going at odd hours, documents being shredded in the middle of the night, and most disturbing of all, the sudden dismissal of 3 long-serving palace staff members without explanation. James had served alongside these people for years. They were loyal, dedicated individuals who had never shown anything but complete devotion to the royal family. Their sudden departure made no sense unless they had discovered something they weren't supposed to know. The breakthrough came when James was assigned to night duty in the corridor outside the king's study. It was nearly midnight when he heard voices through the heavy wooden doors. King Charles was speaking with someone James didn't recognize, their conversation intense and urgent. James knew he shouldn't listen, that his duty was to stand guard, not eavesdrop on royal conversations. But something in the tone of their voices made him step closer to the door. What he heard changed everything. The stranger was blackmailing the king, threatening to release information about a secret that could destroy the monarchy. The man spoke with confidence, knowing he held all the power in the conversation. He demanded money, influence, and most shockingly, he wanted the king to use his position to cover up a series of crimes that went back decades. These weren't minor infractions or political scandals. These were serious crimes involving vulnerable people, cover-ups that had protected wealthy and powerful individuals while leaving victims without justice. James felt his world crashing around him as he listened to the king agree to the demands. This was not the man he had sworn to protect. This was not the monarchy he believed in. The institution he had dedicated his life to serving was being used to protect criminals and silence victims. Everything James had believed about honor, duty, and service felt like a lie. The conversation continued for another hour, with the blackmailer providing more details about the crimes and the cover-up network that reached into the highest levels of government and society. He mentioned names that James recognized, powerful figures who had escaped justice because of their connections and influence. The blackmailer had evidence of it all, documents and recordings that proved the monarchy's involvement in protecting these criminals. When the meeting finally ended, James barely managed to return to his position before the stranger emerged from the study. The man was well-dressed, confident, and wore the expression of someone who knew he had just won a crucial victory. He walked past James without a glance, but James could feel the evil radiating from this person who was now controlling the King of England. The next few days were torture for James. He went through his duties mechanically, his mind constantly wrestling with what he had learned. He had been trained to follow orders without question, to protect the royal family with his life if necessary. But how could he protect someone who was protecting criminals? How could he serve an institution that was being used to cover up serious crimes against innocent people? James tried to convince himself that he had misunderstood what he heard, that there must be some explanation that would make everything make sense again. He researched the names mentioned in the conversation, hoping to find evidence that would disprove what he feared. Instead, he found more confirmation. News articles about mysterious case dismissals, victims who had suddenly withdrawn their complaints, and investigations that had been quietly dropped without explanation. The weight of this knowledge began affecting every aspect of James's life. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and found it increasingly difficult to maintain the stoic composure expected of a royal guard. His fellow guardsmen noticed the change but attributed it to personal problems. James wished it were that simple. 3 weeks after that terrible night, James received news that would force him to make the most difficult decision of his life. The blackmailer had returned with new demands, and this time the crimes he was asking the king to cover up involved children. James learned this from another overheard conversation, and the horror of it made him physically sick. Children were being hurt, and the people responsible were going to walk free because of royal protection. That night, James sat in his small flat, staring at his uniform hanging on the closet door. The red fabric and gleaming buttons that had once filled him with pride now felt like symbols of his complicity in something monstrous. He thought about his grandfather's stories of serving with honor, his father's dedication to protecting Queen Elizabeth, and his own childhood dreams of serving the crown. All of it felt corrupted now. James knew that speaking out would end his career, and probably result in serious legal consequences. The Official Secrets Act meant that revealing what he had learned could land him in prison for years. But staying silent meant becoming part of the cover-up, helping to protect people who hurt children and other innocent victims. As the sun rose on what would become the most important day in James Harrison's life, he made his decision. He would stop the king from participating in this corruption, even if it meant destroying his own life in the process. Some things were more important than duty, more important than tradition, and more important than his own future. The morning inspection was scheduled for 9 o'clock. James would have one chance to act. One moment when he could step forward and change everything. He didn't know exactly what he would say or how he would say it, but he knew he had to try. The children being hurt by this system deserved someone to speak for them, even if that someone was just a royal guard who was about to throw his life away. As James put on his uniform for what he knew would be the last time, he thought about the oath he had taken when he joined the royal guard. He had sworn to protect the crown and defend the realm. Today, he would discover that sometimes protecting the crown meant protecting it from itself, and defending the realm meant standing up to the very people he had been trained to serve. The morning air was crisp and clean as King Charles III walked across the Windsor Castle courtyard toward the assembled royal guard. He moved with the measured pace of someone who had performed this ritual countless times, his polished shoes clicking against the ancient stone with mechanical precision. To any observer, this appeared to be just another routine inspection, one of hundreds that had taken place over the centuries of royal tradition. But James Harrison knew better. As he stood in formation with his fellow guardsmen, James could see the tension in the king's shoulders, the way his eyes didn't quite meet anyone's gaze directly. The king was carrying the weight of his terrible secret, and James was perhaps the only person in the courtyard who understood the true burden that Charles bore. The night before, James had barely slept. He had spent hours pacing his small flat, rehearsing what he would say and how he would say it. He knew he would have only seconds to act before security would intervene and drag him away. Whatever message he needed to deliver would have to be clear, powerful, and impossible to ignore or dismiss. James had considered going through official channels, reporting what he knew to his superiors or to some government authority, but he quickly realized that the corruption he had discovered reached too high into the establishment. The very people who should have been investigating these crimes were likely part of the cover-up network. The only way to ensure that the truth came to light was to make it public, to force the story into the open where it couldn't be buried or dismissed. As the king approached their section of the formation, James felt his heart hammering against his ribs. His mouth was dry, and his hands were trembling slightly despite his years of military training. He had faced dangerous situations before, had stood guard during terrorist threats and security alerts, but nothing had prepared him for this moment when he would have to betray everything he had been trained to do. The king was now just 10 feet away, moving down the line of guards with the practiced eye of someone inspecting troops. Each guardsman stood perfectly still as Charles passed, their training keeping them motionless even under the direct gaze of the monarch. James had done this same inspection dozens of times before, maintaining perfect composure while the king examined his uniform and bearing, but today would be different. Today, James would break the most sacred rule of royal service. King Charles stopped directly in front of James, as he always did during these inspections. For a brief moment their eyes met, and James saw something in the king's expression that he had never noticed before. There was pain there, and fear, and what looked like a desperate plea for help. It was as if Charles knew that James had discovered his terrible secret and was silently begging him to understand the impossible position he was in. This moment of connection gave James the strength he needed. He realized that the king was not the villain in this story but another victim of the same corrupt system that was protecting criminals and silencing their victims. Charles was being forced to choose between destroying the monarchy and protecting people who hurt children. It was an impossible choice that no person should have to make alone. James stepped forward. The movement was so unexpected, so completely against protocol, that it took several seconds for anyone to react. The other guards remained frozen in place, their training telling them to stay still even when something unprecedented was happening right beside them. The king himself seemed stunned, taking a half-step backward as James moved closer. "Your Majesty," James said, his voice clear and strong despite the terror coursing through his veins. "I need to speak with you about the children." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been detonated. King Charles went completely white, his face draining of color as he realized that his deepest secret was no longer secret. The other guards looked confused, unsure of what they were witnessing, but beginning to understand that something extraordinary was happening. Palace security began moving toward James, but King Charles held up a hand to stop them. There was something in the king's expression now that hadn't been there before: relief. For weeks, Charles had been carrying this burden alone, forced to make impossible decisions to protect an institution that was bigger than any individual. Now, suddenly, someone else knew the truth. Someone else understood the terrible position he was in. "How do you know about that?" King Charles asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I've been listening, Your Majesty," James replied. "I know about the blackmail. I know about the cover-ups. I know about the children who are being hurt while their abusers walk free because of royal protection." The king's security detail was getting nervous, unsure of whether this was a threat or something else entirely. Several guards had their hands moving toward their weapons, ready to protect the king from what they perceived as a dangerous situation, but Charles continued to hold them back with subtle gestures, seeming to understand that James posed no physical danger. "You don't understand the complexity of the situation," King Charles said, his voice heavy with pain. "There are forces at work here that are bigger than you can imagine. If I don't comply with their demands, they will destroy everything. The monarchy, the government, centuries of tradition, it will all be gone." James felt a surge of compassion for the man standing before him. This was not the powerful monarch he had been trained to see, but a human being trapped in an impossible situation. The blackmailers had chosen their target well, knowing that someone in Charles's position would feel responsible for protecting the institution of the monarchy even at terrible personal cost. "With respect, Your Majesty," James said, his voice growing stronger with conviction, "some things are more important than tradition. Some things are more important than institutions. The children who are being hurt deserve justice, and they deserve someone in power to stand up for them." The courtyard had gone completely silent except for the wind whistling through the ancient stones. The other guards were still frozen in place, unsure of what they were witnessing, but beginning to understand that they were seeing something that would change everything. Palace staff had gathered at windows and doorways, drawn by the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. King Charles looked around at all the faces watching him, and James could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. For his entire life, Charles had been taught that his primary duty was to protect and preserve the monarchy. He had been raised to believe that the institution was more important than any individual, including himself, but now he was being forced to choose between that duty and basic human decency. "What would you have me do?" King Charles asked, and there was genuine desperation in his voice. "If I refuse their demands, they will release information that will destroy not just me, but everyone associated with the monarchy. Innocent people will be hurt. The entire system of government could collapse." James had anticipated this argument, and he had his answer ready. "Your Majesty, the system is already corrupt. It's already hurting innocent people. The only difference is that right now, the victims are powerless children instead of powerful adults. If we have to choose who gets hurt, shouldn't we choose to protect the most vulnerable?" The logic of James's argument was undeniable, and King Charles seemed to understand that his guard was offering him a way out of an impossible situation. For weeks, Charles had been trapped by his sense of duty to the institution, but James was helping him see that his real duty was to something higher than tradition or protocol. "They have evidence," King Charles said quietly. "Documents, recordings, photographs. They can prove that members of the royal family and government officials have been covering up these crimes for decades. If that information becomes public, it won't just destroy the current monarchy, it will delegitimize the entire system." James nodded, understanding the magnitude of what the king was telling him. The corruption wasn't recent or limited, it was systemic and had been going on for generations. The blackmailers had built their power by collecting evidence of this corruption, knowing that eventually they would be able to use it to control the most powerful people in the country. "Then maybe it's time for the truth," James said simply. "Maybe the system needs to be delegitimized if it's built on protecting criminals. Maybe it's time to start over with something better." The words were treason in the most literal sense, but they rang with truth that neither James nor King Charles could deny. The institution they both served had become so corrupt that it was actively harming the people it was supposed to protect. Preserving such a system wasn't noble or dutiful, it was criminal. King Charles stood in silence for a long moment, weighing decades of training and tradition against the simple moral clarity of what James had told him. Around the courtyard, security personnel and palace staff waited to see what would happen next, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the monarchy. Finally, King Charles nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "God help us both, but you're absolutely right." Within minutes of King Charles's admission, the palace erupted into controlled chaos. Security teams that had been stationed throughout the grounds converged on the courtyard, their radios crackling with urgent communications. Senior advisors who had been watching from windows came rushing across the stone paths, their faces pale with shock and concern. The carefully choreographed world of royal protocol had been shattered by a single moment of truth. James found himself surrounded by security personnel, but King Charles continued to hold them back from taking any aggressive action. The king understood that arresting James would only make the situation worse, drawing attention to exactly the kind of incident they needed to keep quiet. Instead, Charles made a decision that would prove to be either brilliant or catastrophic. "Clear the courtyard," King Charles commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had been bred into him over decades of royal training. "I want to speak with Harrison privately." The security chief, a stern man named Robert Sterling who had served the royal family for over 20 years, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Your Majesty, I strongly advise against private discussions with someone who has just violated multiple protocols and potentially compromised security. We don't know what his intentions are or whether he represents a larger threat." King Charles turned to face Sterling, and James could see steel in the monarch's expression that hadn't been there during the blackmail conversations. This was the voice of a king who had decided to take control of his own destiny rather than being controlled by others. "Mr. Gossip, Sterling, I appreciate your concern for my safety, but I am still the King of England. I am ordering you to clear this courtyard so I can have a private conversation with one of my guards. If you cannot follow that order, I will find someone who can." The threat was unmistakable, and Sterling had no choice but to comply. He gestured to his security teams, who began ushering the other guards and palace staff away from the immediate area. Within 5 minutes, the courtyard was empty except for King Charles and James, though both men knew they were being watched from multiple locations and that their conversation was almost certainly being recorded. "Before we go any further," King Charles said once they were alone, "I need to know exactly how much you've learned and whether you've shared this information with anyone else." James had prepared for this question, knowing that his answer would determine whether he lived through the day or disappeared quietly like the 3 palace staff members who had been dismissed. "I've told no one, Your Majesty, but I've written everything down and left detailed accounts in multiple locations with instructions for their release if anything happens to me." It was a lie, but a necessary one. James had actually told no one and written nothing down, not wanting to involve innocent people in something so dangerous. But he knew that making himself too easy to eliminate would be a fatal mistake. King Charles needed to believe that silencing James would only make the situation worse. The king smiled grimly, recognizing the strategy. "Smart. I probably would have done the same thing in your position." He paused, looking around the empty courtyard that had been witness to centuries of royal ceremonies. "Tell me exactly what you know, and don't leave anything out. If we're going to find a solution to this problem, I need to understand how deep your knowledge goes." For the next hour, James recounted everything he had learned. He described the overheard conversations, the mysterious visitors, the dismissed staff members, and most importantly, the blackmail demands that were forcing the king to protect criminals. King Charles listened in silence, occasionally asking for clarification but never denying or contradicting anything James said. When James finished his account, King Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ancient stones beneath their feet. "You've only learned a small part of the truth," he said finally. "The situation is much worse than you realize, and it goes back much further than you might imagine." What King Charles revealed next made James's blood run cold. The corruption wasn't limited to covering up recent crimes. It was a systematic network that had been operating for decades, protecting wealthy and powerful individuals who engaged in the most horrible kinds of abuse. Members of parliament, judges, senior police officers, media moguls, and even members of the royal family had all been involved either as perpetrators or as protectors of perpetrators. The blackmailer, who had been making demands on King Charles, was just one member of a larger organization that had spent years collecting evidence of these crimes. They had photographs, videos, financial records, and witness testimonies that could destroy dozens of powerful people and institutions. Their strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of using the evidence to seek justice for victims, they used it to gain power over the very people who should have been prosecuted. "They don't want money," King Charles explained, his voice heavy with despair. "Money would be easy. They want control. They want to be able to direct government policy, influence judicial decisions, and shape media coverage. They've essentially taken control of the country by blackmailing everyone in positions of power." James felt overwhelmed by the scope of what he was learning. This wasn't just about protecting a few criminals. It was about the systematic corruption of an entire government. The blackmailers had created a shadow system of control that operated behind the scenes, manipulating the very people who were supposed to be serving the public. "How long has this been going on?" James asked. "The current organization has been operating for about 15 years, King Charles replied. "But the underlying corruption goes back much further. There have always been networks of powerful people protecting each other from consequences. This group just figured out how to weaponize that corruption and use it to gain control over the entire system." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Thornton, the king's principal private secretary and one of the most powerful people in the palace hierarchy. She approached them with the careful steps of someone walking into a minefield, her normally perfect composure showing cracks of strain. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "we have a situation developing that requires immediate attention. News outlets have begun making inquiries about unusual activity at the palace this morning. Someone appears to have leaked information about the incident in the courtyard." King Charles closed his eyes, understanding immediately what this meant. The blackmailers had people watching the palace constantly, and they would have seen James's unprecedented action during the inspection. They would know that their secret was no longer secret, and they would be taking action to protect themselves. "How much time do we have?" King Charles asked. "Based on the nature of the inquiries, I would estimate that we have perhaps 6 to 8 hours before someone publishes a story," Margaret replied. "The reporters don't seem to have details yet, but they know something significant happened during the guard inspection this morning." James realized that his action had started a countdown that could not be stopped. The blackmailers would not wait to see how much King Charles had revealed or what actions he might take. They would assume the worst and act accordingly, which meant releasing their evidence to destroy the monarchy before it could take action against them. "There is one option," King Charles said slowly, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We could get ahead of the story. We could release the truth ourselves before they have a chance to control the narrative." Margaret looked horrified at the suggestion. "Your Majesty, that would be incredibly dangerous. We don't know how the public would react to revelations about systematic corruption in government. It could lead to complete social breakdown." But James could see that King Charles had already made his decision. The monarch's expression had changed from despair to determination, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For weeks, Charles had been trapped by the impossible choice between protecting criminals and protecting the monarchy. Now he saw a third option: destroying the corrupt system in order to save whatever was worth preserving. "Margaret," King Charles said firmly, "I want you to contact every major news outlet in the country. Tell them I will be making a statement to the nation at 6 o'clock tonight, a statement that will change everything." "Sir, I must strongly advise against this course of action," Margaret replied. "The consequences could be catastrophic for the monarchy, for the government, and for the country as a whole." King Charles smiled, and James was surprised to see that it was the first genuine smile he had seen on the king's face since this all began. "Margaret, the consequences of continuing to protect these people would be far worse than the consequences of exposing them. At least this way, we get to control how the truth comes out." As Margaret hurried away to make the necessary arrangements, King Charles turned back to James. "You realize that you've essentially ended your career in the Royal Guard?" James nodded. "I understood that when I decided to step forward this morning, Your Majesty." "Good. King Charles said, because I have a different job for you now. I need someone I can trust to help me prepare for what comes next. Someone who has already proven that they're willing to do the right thing regardless of the personal cost. The irony was not lost on James that breaking the most fundamental rule of royal service had earned him the trust of the king himself. But as he looked around the courtyard where his old life had ended just a few hours earlier, James understood that some rules were meant to be broken when they stood in the way of justice. The next few hours would determine whether their decision to choose truth over tradition would save the monarchy or destroy it completely. But for the first time in weeks, both men felt the weight of moral certainty rather than the crushing burden of complicity and evil. The hours between the courtyard confrontation and the scheduled address passed in a blur of frantic activity. Palace staff moved through the corridors with urgent purpose, their faces reflecting the gravity of what was about to happen. Television crews from every major network in the country began assembling outside the palace gates, sensing that whatever announcement was coming would be historically significant. James found himself in the unprecedented position of sitting in the king's private study, helping to draft what would become one of the most important speeches in the history of the British monarchy. The room where he had first overheard the blackmail conversation now served as the headquarters for an operation that would either save or destroy the institution of the crown. King Charles had insisted on writing the speech himself, but he wanted James present to ensure that the perspective of an ordinary citizen was represented in the address. "You saw this corruption from the outside," Charles explained as he worked on draft after draft. "You understood immediately that protecting criminals was wrong, regardless of the political consequences. I need that clarity of vision to help me communicate why this revelation is necessary." As they worked, more details about the scope of the corruption emerged. Margaret Thornton had spent the afternoon conducting discreet inquiries, and the information she gathered painted a picture of systematic abuse that went far deeper than even King Charles had realized. The blackmail network had files on dozens of powerful individuals, including cabinet ministers, senior judges, police commissioners, and media executives. The victims, Margaret reported during one of her briefings, number in the hundreds. Most were children when the abuse occurred, and many are now adults who have spent decades being silenced by the very institutions that should have protected them. The human cost of the cover-up became increasingly clear as the afternoon progressed. James learned about investigations that had been mysteriously dropped, evidence that had disappeared from police custody, witnesses who had been intimidated into silence, and journalists who had been threatened or discredited when they tried to expose the truth. The blackmail network had essentially created a parallel justice system that protected the wealthy and powerful while abandoning their victims. At 4 o'clock, just 2 hours before the scheduled address, the blackmailers made their move. Margaret burst into the king's study with her face white with shock, carrying a tablet computer that she placed in front of King Charles without saying a word. The screen showed a private website that had been sent to every major news outlet in the country. It contained a carefully curated selection of the evidence the blackmailers had collected, photographs, financial records, and witness testimonies that implicated dozens of powerful people in the most serious crimes imaginable. But the evidence was presented in a way that made King Charles appear to be one of the primary architects of the cover-up, rather than one of its victims. "They've manipulated the narrative," King Charles said after reviewing the material. "They're making it appear that the royal family was leading the conspiracy, rather than being forced to participate in it." James studied the website over the king's shoulder, and he could see how skillfully the blackmailers had crafted their story. By selectively editing conversations and taking documents out of context, they had created a version of events that cast King Charles as a willing participant in protecting criminals rather than someone who had been coerced through threats and manipulation. This is why they were confident, James realized. They weren't just collecting evidence of crimes, they were collecting evidence in a way that would allow them to control the narrative when it was eventually released. The release of this evidence created an immediate crisis. News outlets that had been waiting for the king's 6 o'clock address were now scrambling to verify and report on the shocking allegations that had been sent to them. Palace phones began ringing constantly, with requests for comment, and crowds of protesters started gathering outside the gates. Margaret was fielding calls from government officials, media executives, and royal family members, who were all demanding to know what was happening, and what the palace's response would be. The carefully controlled world of royal communications had been thrown into complete chaos by the blackmailers' preemptive strike. "They want us to panic," King Charles said, his voice remaining steady despite the crisis unfolding around them. "They want us to cancel the address and try to deny these allegations, which would make us look guilty and allow them to control the story completely." But instead of retreating, King Charles made a decision that surprised. He moved the address up to 5 o'clock and expanded it from a brief statement to a full hour-long explanation of the entire situation, Rather than trying to deny or deflect the allegations, he would meet them head-on by providing the complete context that the blackmailers had deliberately omitted. "If we're going to tell the truth," King Charles said as he finalized his speech, "we're going to tell all of it. Every ugly detail, every difficult decision, every moment where I failed to do the right thing because I was more concerned with protecting the institution than protecting innocent people." James watched in amazement as King Charles transformed before his eyes. The man who had been broken and defeated by the blackmailers just hours earlier was now showing the strength and determination of someone who had found his moral center. The king was no longer trying to preserve his reputation or protect the monarchy from scandal. He was focused entirely on ensuring that the truth came out in a way that would lead to justice for the victims. At exactly 5 o'clock, King Charles walked into the palace's stateroom, where television cameras had been set up for the address. James stood in the back of the room, alongside palace staff and security personnel, all of whom understood they were about to witness either the salvation or destruction of the British monarchy. The king began his address by acknowledging the allegations that had been released that afternoon. Rather than denying them, he confirmed that many of the documents and evidence were genuine. But then he provided the context that the blackmailers had omitted: the threats, the manipulation, and the impossible choices he had been forced to make. "For weeks I have been part of a system that protected criminals while abandoning their victims," King Charles said, looking directly into the camera. "I participated in this system not because I believed it was right, but because I was told it was the only way to preserve the institutions that millions of people depend on. I was wrong." The king went on to explain how the blackmail network operated, how they collected evidence not to seek justice, but to gain power over those who should have been prosecuted. He revealed the scope of the corruption that reached into every level of government and society, and he acknowledged his own complicity in allowing it to continue. But the most powerful moment of the address came when King Charles looked directly into the camera and spoke to the victims who had been silenced for so long. "To every person who was hurt by the crimes we helped cover up, to every victim who was denied justice because we prioritized protecting powerful people over protecting the innocent, I offer my deepest apology and my commitment to ensuring that you finally receive the justice you deserve." King Charles announced that he was immediately suspending his royal duties and calling for a complete investigation of the corruption network. He was turning over all evidence in the palace's possession to law enforcement agencies and international organizations to ensure that the investigation could not be controlled or manipulated by those who had been part of the cover-up. Most importantly, King Charles announced the establishment of a victim support fund that would provide financial assistance and counseling services to everyone who had been harmed by the crimes that had been covered up. The fund would be managed by independent organizations to ensure that it served victims rather than protecting the institutions that had failed them. As the address concluded, James felt a complex mix of emotions. The truth was finally out, and victims would finally have the opportunity for justice that they had been denied for so long. But the cost had been enormous. The monarchy as it had existed for centuries was effectively over, and the government would face a crisis of legitimacy that could take years to resolve. The immediate reaction to the address was explosive. Protesters outside the palace were divided between those calling for King Charles to abdicate immediately and those praising his courage in exposing the corruption. News outlets struggled to process the enormous amount of information that had been revealed, and government officials began distancing themselves from colleagues who had been implicated in the cover-up. But in the midst of all the chaos and uncertainty, James felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. The system that had protected criminals was finally being exposed, and for the first time in decades, victims would have voices that could not be silenced by money, power, or influence. The decision to step forward during the morning inspection had started a chain reaction that would reshape British society in ways that no one could yet predict. But whatever emerged from the ruins of the old system would have to be built on the foundation of truth rather than the protection of those who abused their power. 6 months after King Charles's shocking address to the nation, Britain had become a fundamentally different country. The revelations about systematic corruption had triggered the largest investigation in modern British history, leading to arrests, resignations, and reforms that touched every level of government and society. James Harrison sat in a small cafe near his new office in London, reading the morning newspaper while waiting for his first appointment of the day. The headlines were still dominated by developments in what the media had dubbed the Palace Papers scandal, but the tone had shifted from crisis reporting to coverage of the rebuilding process that was slowly taking shape across the country. James's life had changed dramatically since that morning in the Windsor Castle courtyard. His decision to step forward and confront King Charles had ended his career as a royal guard, but launched him into a role he never could have imagined. He was now the director of the Victim Advocacy Initiative, a new organization established by Parliament to ensure that those who had been silenced by the corruption network finally had voices in the justice system. The transition had not been easy. In the immediate aftermath of the revelations, James had faced death threats from people who blamed him for destroying cherished institutions. He had also faced skepticism from victim advocates who questioned whether someone with his background could truly represent their interests. But over time, James had proven that his commitment to justice was genuine, and his understanding of institutional corruption was invaluable. The investigation that followed King Charles's address had exceeded everyone's expectations in its scope and effectiveness. International law enforcement agencies had become involved to ensure that the inquiry could not be compromised by domestic political pressure. Hundreds of victims had come forward to provide testimony, and the evidence collected painted a picture of abuse and cover-up that stretched back decades. More than 50 powerful individuals had been arrested and charged with various crimes, including several members of parliament, 3 high court judges, 2 senior police officials, and multiple media executives. The trials were ongoing, but early convictions had already resulted in significant prison sentences and the recovery of millions of pounds in assets that would be used to compensate victims. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation had revealed the full scope of the blackmail network that had controlled so many powerful people. The organization had operated like a shadow government, collecting evidence of crimes and using it to influence policy decisions, judicial rulings, and media coverage. By exposing this network, King Charles's revelations had effectively dismantled a system of corruption that had operated with impunity for years. King Charles himself had faced intense scrutiny throughout the investigation. While prosecutors ultimately concluded that his actions had been motivated by coercion rather than criminal intent, the monarch had chosen to abdicate his throne rather than attempt to restore his damaged reputation. His final act as king had been to sign legislation establishing new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future abuse of royal power. The abdication had triggered a constitutional crisis that was still being resolved. Prince William had initially been expected to assume the throne, but he had surprised everyone by announcing that he would only accept the crown if the monarchy was fundamentally reformed. The negotiations between Parliament, the royal family, and constitutional experts had resulted in the most significant changes to the British system of government in centuries. Under the new constitutional arrangements, the monarchy's role had been drastically reduced. The crown would continue to exist as a ceremonial institution, but its political power would be virtually eliminated. New transparency requirements would ensure that royal activities could be monitored by independent oversight bodies, and the royal family's finances would be subject to the same scrutiny as other public institutions. James finished his coffee and walked to his office building, where he was greeted by the sight of Sarah Chen, one of the victims who had become a powerful advocate for reform. Sarah had been abused as a child by a prominent businessman who had escaped prosecution through the protection of the corruption network. She was now working with James's organization to ensure that other survivors received the support they needed to rebuild their lives. "The Morrison trial starts today," Sarah said as James entered the building. Morrison was one of the most prominent defendants, a former government minister who had been charged with multiple counts of child abuse. 3 more survivors have agreed to testify, which should strengthen the prosecution's case significantly. James nodded, feeling the familiar mix of hope and anxiety that accompanied each new trial. Every conviction brought justice for victims and sent a message that no one was too powerful to be held accountable for their crimes. But each trial also reopened wounds and forced survivors to relive traumatic experiences that many had spent years trying to forget. "How are they holding up?" James asked, referring to the witnesses who would be testifying. "Better than expected," Sarah replied. "Knowing that they're finally being heard, that their voices matter, seems to give them strength. It's what we all needed. The knowledge that the system is finally working for us instead of against us." The morning was spent in meetings with government officials, law enforcement representatives, and victim support organizations. The coordination required to handle an investigation of this magnitude was enormous, and James often felt overwhelmed by the complexity of ensuring that justice was served while protecting the welfare of vulnerable witnesses. At lunch, James received a call that he had been expecting but still dreaded. It was from Margaret Thornton, the former palace secretary, who had played a crucial role in the events 6 months earlier. Margaret had left her position after the revelations, but had remained in contact with James, as someone who shared his commitment to seeing the process through to completion. "James, I have some difficult news," Margaret said. "We've received information that suggests the blackmail network was larger than we initially realized. There may be additional cells operating in other countries, possibly with connections to organized crime groups." The news was disappointing but not entirely surprising. An operation as sophisticated as the one they had exposed was unlikely to be limited to a single country or organization. James understood that the investigation would need to expand internationally if they were to prevent similar networks from simply moving their operations to other jurisdictions. What kind of international cooperation are we talking about? James asked. The European Union has expressed interest in launching a coordinated investigation across member countries, Margaret replied. There's also been contact from agencies in Australia, Canada, and the United States. It appears that this problem is much more widespread than anyone initially realized. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Margaret providing details about evidence that suggested the British network had been part of a larger international system. The implications were staggering. If similar corruption existed in other democracies, the damage to public trust in institutions could be even more severe than what Britain had experienced. After ending the call, James sat in his office contemplating the magnitude of what they had uncovered. 6 months ago, he had been a simple palace guard who had stumbled upon evidence of corruption. Now he was part of an investigation that could reshape the entire global understanding of how power operated in democratic societies. But despite the overwhelming nature of the challenge, James felt more hopeful than he had in years. The system that had protected criminals for so long was finally being dismantled, and victims who had been silenced for decades were finally being heard. The process was messy, painful, and sometimes chaotic, but it was also necessary and long overdue. That evening, James attended a support group meeting for survivors of institutional abuse. These gatherings had become an important part of his work, providing him with direct insight into how the investigation and reform process was affecting real people's lives. The stories he heard were often heartbreaking, but they also demonstrated remarkable resilience and courage. One of the attendees, a woman named Patricia, who had been abused by a prominent judge in the 1990s, stood up to address the group. 6 months ago, I thought I would take my secret to the grave, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her words. I thought no one would believe me, and that even if they did, nothing would change because the people who hurt me were too powerful to touch. Patricia paused, looking around the room at the faces of other survivors who understood her experience in ways that few people could. But today, the man who abused me is sitting in a prison cell, and his victims are being believed and supported. That guard who stepped forward in the palace courtyard didn't just save those children who were being hurt right now, he saved all of us who had been hurt in the past. As James listened to Patricia's words, he reflected on the chain of events that had brought them to this point. His decision to break protocol and confront King Charles had been driven by a simple moral conviction that protecting children was more important than preserving institutions. He had never imagined that this single act would trigger such profound changes throughout society. The investigation was far from over, and the process of rebuilding trust in British institutions would take years or even decades to complete. But the foundation had been laid for a system based on accountability rather than protection of the powerful, on transparency rather than secrecy, and on justice for all rather than privilege for a few. As he walked home through the London streets that night, James thought about the conversation he had overheard in the palace corridor that had started everything. The blackmailer who had seemed so confident in his power to control kings and governments was now serving a 25-year prison sentence. The network that had seemed invincible had been dismantled by the simple act of one person choosing to speak the truth regardless of the personal cost. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in his adult life, James believed that the institutions of power would serve justice rather than subvert it. And that belief, shared by millions of people across the country, would be the foundation upon which a better system could be built.